The Thermaltake View 71 Snow Edition shows off your build in style with a frosty white paint job and 4 tempered glass side panels. You also get 2 pre-installed 140mm ring white LED fans, a vertical GPU mount with bracket, and 3-way radiator support for water cooling. So click the sponsor link in the description to learn more.
Excellent!
What's up guys, how's it going, and welcome back to Paul's Hardware. Today's video is my follow-up to my monthly build series. Every month I part out some builds at the beginning of the month for people who aren't familiar with putting computers together, and then I build one of the systems and then I test it later on. So this is the testing video for this $1,200-ish Mini-ITX system. It's meant to be small, it's meant to be powerful, it's meant to be able to play video games of course, but also do game streaming, video editing, since you have an 8-core processor in there, as well as a GTX 1070. But if you go back to the original planning video, I also pointed out how you could easily drop in a 1070 Ti or a 1080 even, depending on the prices that are available. Now, one quick note about this system as it is put together and being tested here is that I actually use the 2700X CPU in here. Now there's 4 or 5 different 8-core processors available on the AM4 platform from AMD, Ryzen 1st Gen as well as Ryzen 2nd Gen. I went with 2nd Gen because we have a B450 motherboard in here, but just so you guys know, if you're going for one of those other 8-core processors, you probably will need to overclock it a little bit in order to achieve the exact same results that I'm going to show you guys today, but overclocking thankfully is possible with B450 motherboards, as well as this motherboard that I have right here. After that build completion video that you guys maybe have already seen, I had to do a little bit of setup, of course, some stuff like, plugging in things where necessary in the power. I have wired up the 802.11 AC Wi-Fi here as well. The Windows 10 installer did not recognize the 802.11 AC Wi-Fi right out of the gate, so bear in mind you might need to plug in Ethernet or perhaps jump onto another computer to go to the Gigabyte website to get the Wi-Fi driver in order to load it up to get everything working. But before I did all that, I did a BIOS update to make sure I had the latest version of the BIOS, and then I went through standard Windows 10 installation procedures, updating the drivers and making sure that all the software was installed, games were installed, and everything was up to date. In the BIOS, I did go and set the XMP setting for the memory, so it's running at DDR4 3000 speed, and I had no problem with stability after that. And I guess I should point out that I was doing all this testing out in the dining room, and that's simply so I could have a little bit more control over temperatures since it is the middle of the summer here. So ambient temperatures were about 81 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's about 27 degrees Celsius. So a little on the warmer side. Please bear that in mind as you're looking at some of the temperatures for these tests. I am on a little bit of a time constraint, so my testing was limited, but I think it'll give you a good idea of the performance you can expect. The first test I ran was 3D Mark Firestrike Ultra. This is a synthetic test, but it's very good at showing you the ballpark performance of your graphics card and your overall system, as well as giving you a good point of comparison because there's lots of test results for 3D Mark you can find online. Overall score was 4594, graphics score was 4490, and the physics score was 20,564 thanks to the 8-core CPU. Combined score was 2309, and as the test was running, the max CPU frequency was 4.34 gigahertz. That's just on one core, and that's thanks to XFR2, which will automatically overclock 1 or 2 cores on your processor as long as temperatures are within a reasonable range. I've found that XFR and XFR2 can often get 1 or 2 cores to a higher frequency than you'll be able to achieve if you're just doing manual overclocking, especially if you're trying to go for an all-core overclock. So often with gaming performance, it's better to just leave settings as is in the BIOS rather than going and overclocking yourself. That said, if you're running one of the cheaper 8-core processors like a 1700, definitely worth your while to go over and dabble with overclocking just a bit. The max CPU temperature was 71 degrees for this test, and the GPU temp was 75, so that's getting a little bit warmer, but this is a shorter test. The GPU overclock, by the way, was running at 1961 megahertz, and that is because this is a manufacturer overclocked MSI GTX 1070. Next test is 3D Mark Time Spy. This is also a synthetic, but it is DirectX 12. Overall score of 6,466, graphics score of 6,200, and a CPU score of 8,551. Same max CPU frequency here, hitting 4.34 gigahertz on 1 or 2 cores. And then the CPU die temperature got up to 81 degrees Celsius, and the max GPU temperature went up to 81 degrees Celsius as well. Time Spy is a longer test, so it gave the components more time to heat up. And since I wasn't doing a full stress test on this with like a CPU and GPU load, load, I was thinking, you know what, that's a little bit too warm for my taste. So I decided at this point to do a slight modification to the original build and just install a second 120mm intake fan up at the front. Now I mentioned in the build video that there's not a lot of room up in the front with this build because the graphics card I chose is fairly long. So if you are building this system and you waited to watch this follow-up video on the performance, I would definitely recommend adding a second fan, another 120 at the front, to give yourself just a bit more airflow and keep things cooler. But also maybe double check your graphics card again when you purchase it. There's lots of shorter graphics cards. Even the Founders Edition graphics cards would be a great solution here because they're only 10.5 inches long. But consider something like that to give yourself more airflow, give yourself a better overall experience with the system, and keep your components a bit cooler, especially if you're in the summer months when things are warmer when it comes to the ambient. The fan I installed is the Noctua NF A12X15 PWM, and that fortunately was able to tuck right in there up in front. And with that added in, I ran the 3D Mark Time Spy run one more time. Max CPU temp now was 75.5 degrees and the max GPU temp was 79. So about 5.5 degrees cooler on the GPU and about 2 degrees cooler on the CPU. That's a reasonable improvement, especially considering that it's a slim fan. Now I mentioned I was a little short on time for this testing, but I did manage to get a run of GTA 5 in, just playing at 1920 by 1080. Average frame rate was 123 frames per second, 1% low was 79, 0.1% low was 70. The max CPU frequency was still hitting 4.34 gigahertz in this test, and fortunately with a bit of a more reasonable gaming load, so if you're comparing those time spy tests and thinking, oh, things are getting too warm, this test is more like you're actually just playing a game, and here the CPU temperature only got up to 66.3 degrees Celsius. GPU temperature was at 73, so we're still well within our tolerable temperatures as far as that goes. I also want to point out here that your GPU and CPU in this system are both designed to clock themselves higher when temperatures are lower, but also dial that clock speed down a little bit when things get a little bit too warm. So don't necessarily consider that, oh, it's getting too warm and it's throttling. It's simply adjusting the clock speeds to make sure things don't overheat. But of course, if you are concerned about overheating, there are plenty of additional fan locations on this case, so you can add more fans, evacuate more of that warm air, and give yourself probably a little bit better performance in the long run. Apart from raw performance and temps, the last thing to really test with this system is going to be noise generation, so here is a quick sound test. So things are staying pretty quiet overall with this system, even under load, and I think that's really what it boils down to with this build is, yes, there are some caveats here and there to keep in mind, stuff about AMD with the Ryzen platform, temperatures, but overall everything fits together really nicely. There's a lot of performance built in there, and of course you got that expansion capability with the additional 2.5 inch and 3.5 inch drive mounts, as well as the ability to add more fans. Oh, and I should point out, this system does support a 240mm all-in-one radiator. I would make sure that it is on the smaller side as those go, but I finally did actually look up the manual for this on the RioToro website, and it does confirm that that is a possibility too. So if you weren't stoked on this cooling situation for the CPU, you could add one of those in the front if you so desired. But guys, that wraps it up for this video. Again, links to this entire build is down in the video's description. Check out the build video and the planning video as well if you want to see how it was put together, or some other ideas for parts you might want to swap in if you want to save some money. There is an $800 version of this build that I put together as well. Thank you guys so much for watching though. Hit the thumbs up button on your way out. Subscribe if you want to see more content coming at you very soon, and we'll see you guys in the next video.